Welcome to Food for Thought. My name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau from Compassionate Cooks. I founded Compassionate Cooks to empower people to make informed food choices and to debunk myths about vegetarianism and animal rights. You can learn more about who we are and what we do by visiting our website, compassionatecooks.com. Hi, everybody. I hope you're all doing very well. Thank you, as always, for your amazing letters and emails and support. Today we have two sponsors, the first of whom asked me to use Cheryl Cat Mom in Vermont as her name. She sponsored the podcast and wrote a lovely email. She wrote, "Dear Colleen, I started listening to your podcast in the last couple of months. I am now catching up on many missed episodes. Of course, I want to support your podcast and your life-affirming work. That's the big reason I sponsored. The smaller reason, the one that all by itself would have made me a supporter, is your better than tuna salad recipe that I heard on an episode. I am now officially addicted to food processed beans mixed with vegan mayo and relish. I have eaten it every day since I heard the podcast, and I don't even want to say how many days that is. I also want you to know how much I appreciate your incorporation of literature and cultural history into your show. That really holds my attention. You might be interested to know that when I was an undergrad English major in the mid 1980s, I took a short story writing class co-taught by Isaac Bashevis Singer. At the time, I was asleep to most animal issues, though I and my family of origin always adopted homeless animals. Still, I don't recall Singer making any mention of animals or vegetarianism. Now I wish that he had. Thanks again for all you do for the animals and for the inspiration and community you provide for people." Thank you, Cheryl. Since you specifically mentioned your affinity for the literature on the podcast, I thought it fitting that you sponsor this particular episode. I hope you agree. Thank you so much for your support, and I'm so thrilled that you're enjoying that recipe and hopefully others. Our second sponsor is Mark Hawthorne. Mark Hawthorne is a fellow activist for the animals, and he wrote me a terribly sweet email that moved me very much. He wrote, "As a fellow activist, I have had many low moments. It is all too easy to feel discouraged when we literally see animal abuse everywhere we turn. Even my dreams are filled with cruelty I've witnessed, with the images of slaughtered seals, the plaintive sounds of a dairy cow calling for her lost baby, and with the heartbreaking faces of the exhausted, ammonia-scalded chickens I could not rescue. As you know, last year I wrote a book on animal activism, and as you know, writing about animal suffering can be grueling. What you don't know is that throughout the often painful writing process, listening to your podcast buoyed my spirits. Your positive attitude was always an ideal tonic that put me in the proper frame of mind to create what I hope is a source of inspiration for other activists. I'm sponsoring your podcast to help ensure your words continue to inspire a global audience, because I know that teaching the world about the injustices done to animals and what we can do to stop them are critical steps in humanity's path toward total liberation for all beings. Thank you for being such a powerful voice for animals, Colleen. Thanks to you and other activists like you, the cries of the defenseless are not ignored. Keep up the wonderful work." And I say the same to you, Mark. Mark is an eloquent writer, as you can tell just from his email, whose book, Striking at the Roots, A Practical Guide to Animal Activism, really is a must-have for anyone who has ever said, "I want to help, but I don't know how." Mark's book is a comprehensive guide for anyone who wants to act on behalf of animals and wants to find the right place for them. So check out his book, Striking at the Roots. Thank you, Mark, and thank you for all you do for the animals, and thank you for your support of the podcast. Mark's book, by the way, is available in my Amazon store, and I'll include a direct link on the Compassionate Cooks community message board, which you can reach at compassionatecookscommunity.com. Sponsors like Cheryl and Mark absolutely keep this podcast going, so please consider sponsoring if you haven't already. It means so much to me that the podcast has become a place of support and comfort, as well as a resource for information. So you can sponsor monthly or one time, and you can do so by visiting compassionatecooks.com and clicking on support our podcast. Thank you to all of the sponsors, current and past. I'm very, very grateful to you. As regular listeners know, the format for today's episode is such that I read something written by someone other than myself, and I use this opportunity to share with you literature, short stories, essays, poetry, any kind of literary gem that basically celebrates our relationship to animals or sheds light on our exploitation of animals. And today's story is very, very special to me. It was written by a very good friend of mine, Shad Clark. I met Shad, gosh, several years ago now, after his wife Kristen had come to my cooking class and realized that her hubby would love to come. And so they both signed up for the next class and we became fast friends. They were already vegan and had moved to the Bay Area from Florida, and they didn't really know any other vegans at the time. And since they have been here, they have met plenty more and they have created a few new ones. Shad is a filmmaker and a fellow writer, though since I've known him to write mostly screenplays. He's turned a couple of them into short films and he's working on getting them produced into feature films. You can view his short films on his website and even read his scripts. So, hello, if there are any producers out there who are interested in checking out Shad's work, please do so at shadclark.com. That's SHAD Clark.com. One of the things we have in common besides being vegan and animal activist is film. And though we do agree on a lot of films, Shad and I diverge when it comes to the horror films he has an affinity for. I'm too much of a wimp and I have like too much of a visual mind to get into horror films, but Shad is quite the aficionado. In his defense, as if I even have to defend this affinity of his, I don't. Many of the horror films that he likes have, how shall I say, a deeper meaning to them, who use that genre to shed light on some aspect of humanity, not unlike science fiction films or literature who do the same thing. Now, I will never, ever, ever, ever watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it's a perfect example of a horror movie made with a higher consciousness, if you will, though I will never, ever watch it. I've seen enough clips to scar me for my lifetime. But when it came out, it was said to have connections with Nixon and Vietnam and all these other political associations. But when the director, Tobe Hooper, was asked what it was about, he simply stated, it's about meat. That's what this movie is about. It's about meat. It's about the fact that meat is murder no matter how you cut it. Pardon the pun. So, for instance, early on in the movie of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I will never watch, and I've seen these clips actually. The teenagers are driving through Texas and they come across this really horrible stench, which they know can come only from a slaughterhouse or a feedlot. They're kind of near an area where they see some cattle outside. And while one character is describing how the cattle are killed, another says, I like meat, so please change the subject. Leatherface, who is the deranged serial killer in this movie, and his family actually used to work in a slaughterhouse. So they were trained killers. They lost their jobs because the slaughterhouse was put out of business by a larger operation. So throughout the movie, Leatherface kills his victims the way the animals in slaughterhouses are killed. The first victim is killed by a sledgehammer. And as he convulses on the floor, flailing about and screaming, the screams the director uses are not that of a human, they're not that of the actor, but rather of a pig screaming. And that's done a couple times throughout the film. In another scene, a female victim is stuck up on a meat hook, which is really gruesome. But it's all based on what happens in slaughterhouses. And Leatherface and his family actually eat their victims. So essentially, the humans are turned into meat themselves. You really can't miss the parallels. And again, I know this from things I've read, these parallels, and from the few clips that I've seen, and from long talks with Shad. So speaking of higher consciousness horror, one of Shad's short films called Anonymity would fall into this category, and you can watch it on his website, and I encourage you to do so. Other friends of ours were involved in the making of it, and it's got a really fantastic texture, really, really great location, great filming, really effective lighting and cinematography. And the film Anonymity explores people's fascination with real violence, as you'll see when you watch it. But do watch it; it's pretty awesome. Now, I don't want to give the wrong impression and make it seem like Shad produces only horror-based work. He doesn't. If you had to categorize a lot of his writing, I suppose you would call it science fiction, but that might make some people who would typically consider themselves uninterested in that genre avoid Shad's work because of that label. So, look, you know how I feel about putting things in a box. I'm not a fan. And Shad's work is highly intelligent and highly creative. So I really, really encourage you to check it out. Another of Shad's short films that I encourage you to watch is called Side Effects May Include, and that's also on his website. It juxtaposes a soothing voiceover of an antidepressant commercial with images that become more disturbing as the film progresses, ultimately revealing the reality behind whatever it is we're being sold. It's essentially the truth behind the actual marketing of products and ideas. It's really awesome. Side effects may include, you could watch the clip on his website. And again, several of our friends were involved in the making of it, some of whom are in it. And I recorded a bit for Shad. I recorded like some little bit of the voiceover for Shad, and you'll see my name in the end credits, though I'm still convinced that Shad didn't use it in the film. I've seen it several times, and I have never heard myself. So I think Shad was just being nice to put me in the credits of his film. So if you're going to watch it, you're going to be like, where is she? I don't hear her. I know, I don't hear it either. So I've seen Shad's films. I've been part of them in a very small way. I've read some of his screenplays, and we talk about his screenplays all the time. But recently, Shad returned to writing prose, which he had dabbled in before he started focusing on writing for film. And he had some really awesome ideas for stories, and I encouraged him to write them as short stories as opposed to writing screenplays for a change. But I have to be really honest, I had no idea what to expect from Shad. Writing screenplays is very different than writing prose, and reading screenplays is very different. So even reading his screenplays, it didn't give me a sense of how good Shad's writing is. So he had told me his overview of the short story that he wanted to write, the one I'm about to read to you, and I loved the concept. I loved the concept, but I had no idea it was going to be as good as it is. It's fantastic. I knew immediately that I wanted to read it on the podcast. I absolutely love this story. And I'm not just saying this because he's my friend. I'm being very sincere. I wouldn't just read it on the podcast if I didn't think it was good. Now, you're going to listen to it. And for those of you who have listened to the podcast for a while and who have listened to the short stories that I read, you're going to think, wow, like that's perfect for the podcast and for the kinds of stories that I read. You're going to think that Shad clearly wrote it with the podcast in mind. And I have to assure you that that's not the case. It's really incredible. That's one of the things that was so exciting about it. Shad and I obviously have similar sensibilities, so it's not surprising that this story came out of his creative mind. But since Shad has never listened to the podcast, he absolutely did not write this with the podcast in mind. Over time, he's told me his ideas for stories, and I've been like, Shad, you got to listen to the podcast. You got to listen to Beyond the Wub and A Mother's Tale and Pig by Roald Dahl. But no, Shad has never listened. So I suppose I'll have to feature the things that different friends do on this podcast to get them to listen, because now he'll listen to the episode, once I put his story on the air. Really nice. Really, really nice. So let's get to Shad's story, and you'll see why I included it. I didn't include it just so he would listen to the podcast. I think you'll see immediately why, or hear immediately why, I was so excited to share this with all of you. If you'd like to read along, or if you'd like to have access to this story once I'm finished, please go to shadclark.com, click on the little boy pig graphic on the homepage, and then click on the nose of the pig to download the story. So without further ado, I give you Little Boy Pig, a genetically modified tale by Shad Clark. His tender skin exposed to the concrete and conditioned air outside the womb, the newborn piglet clamored towards the warmth of his mother's belly and nestled among his sisters and brothers, all of them tucked like roly-poly parcels of pink, in fine white hair, wee haunches cheek to cheek. Were it not for the delicate coil of his tail, curling in the same bent as all 7 siblings, one might have suspected some prankster of foisting a human infant among piglets. For despite that distinct and unmistakable tail, the frail hind legs of this particular little pig ran seamless pink into pink, ending in neonate feet, each with 5 petite toes. Because of his appearance, and to spite it, the hapless newborn found himself plucked from his family by a laboratory assistant, deaf to all squeals but her own, and whose own alarm swelled upon seeing the infant's front legs anchored as arms. The baby was paraded from one researcher to the next, a procession of gloved hands, prying wide his feeble fingers, pulling the spring from his tail, spinning him this direction, then opposite, upside down, backwards. Whether a piglet with the hands and feet of a human baby, or a human with the head and tail of a piglet, the infant had been born powerless to halt or alter the course set before him, and in that respect was no different than the family he would never see again. Catalogued ZG 4318711214, the child spent the first night of life alone and in the dark circled a padded cell. His infant brain could scarcely divine sense of his sterile surroundings, much less the complex circumstances delivering him into a world without welcome. Though he did not know the word, more than anything he wanted mother. That same night, the chief genetic engineer in charge of the facility slept less like a baby and more like an inferno stoked by the hurricane-force winds of scandal. The public had been assured that Animal Pharm derived its product line from bona fide pigs, even if the genes of those animals were spliced with enough human DNA to render them a commodity of universal organ donors. Their hearts, lungs, livers, pancreases, kidneys, eyes, and intestines were more human than not, but appearances permitted the animals to be seen as far less than the sum of their parts, precisely as their farmed cousins had been regarded all the centuries of slaughter. The long day following saw the little pig blinking helpless and trusting as the scientists in their starched white coats debated his fate. Had he been capable of comprehending the sounds of their heads, he would have trembled to his fragile core. For many of the researchers suggested they vivisect it on the spot, while others recommended they dissect the little corpse after routine euthanasia. All argued as though an incision would be clear-cut. By the end of the day, the scientists agreed only that the world should never know what their work had borne. After all, what would society make of renegade genes, turning the people in their pigs inside out? Moreover, what of the company's stock? Ultimately, the chief genetic engineer chose the most radical path his aching brain could conceive. He opted to let the specimen live. For a time equal to his usefulness in a previously unrealized experiment, ZG 4318711214 would be raised on the isolated country estate that had served as the childhood home of the scientist and his father before him, proving itself a proper environment to rear yet another child, providing such a task was now at hand. Time would reveal the inclinations and limitations of ZG 4318711214's faculties. Would the incidental chimera be content in mud, or would it exhibit the mental prowess of a proper human, replete with the potential for bigger business, faster food, smarter bombs? Such are the measures of human ingenuity and dominion. Ziggy, as the infant was now nicknamed, developed faster than a human and more like a pig. And yet he stood on his two legs and soon toddled about, delighting in every discovery, life to him still wondrous and unspoiled. He reveled in peekaboo and silly song, never suspecting his nanny had accepted her position and suffered stacks of non-disclosure agreements for considerable pay. Of course, she'd been hired for her kindness, and only an unkind person would have found no joy in engaging the hungry mind of this curious and innocent child. One bright afternoon, the nanny grabbed Ziggy's big toe and wiggled it and said, "This little piggy went to market." The irony hit her like a house of bricks. Ziggy had no idea what a piggy was, even if he was, at least in part. In preparation to receive him, the estate's every mirror and reflective surface had been removed. According to the conditions of the experiment, ZG 4318711214 was to never see himself, particularly as anything other than human. Giggling now like any child and snorting as he did, Ziggy waited for the nanny to go on. So she wiggled the next toe. "This little piggy stayed home," and the next, "This little piggy had roast." She replayed in her mind the labels of the jarred food she aeroplaned into his mouth. Beets. This little piggy had roast beets. As Ziggy napped, the nanny searched for old toys stowed out of sight and mind. In a place as obvious as the basement, she uncovered a chest of forgotten plastic and plush, and had only begun to inventory the treasure, screening choking hazards and lead paint, when Ziggy woke. He bristled with eager energy at the first sight of a farmed animal playset hosting among its plastic menagerie a wide-eyed and smiling pig. And when Nanny tried to hide what she had no intention to show, the child cried. The little toy pig quickly became the little boy pig's favorite, and the Nanny was soon asked to explain surveillance footage of Ziggy running about with the molded pig, happily squealing oink oink. In truth, the Nanny saw nothing wrong with the child playing, oinking, and being a child, and after much deliberation the geneticist relented. After all, Ziggy had not only spoken, but in plain English, whereas the first utterance of most children is some iteration of mother or father. Ziggy had neither. His first word was oink. His second word was the name of his Nanny, the third his own. He soon learned the names of all the toy animals, then named each himself. His budding vocabulary allowed the animals to plan grand adventures about the estate, the grounds of which spanned a vast wilderness to explore. The manners of these animals, like Ziggy's own, rang impeccable. He had learned please and thank you, and followed I'm well with and you? He was 8 months old. For his first birthday the Nanny gave him a copy of Charlotte's Web. Never had Ziggy been so moved than by the plight of Wilbur the pig. He could not fathom facing a fate as dire, and was happy for the outcome save Charlotte's end. This was the child's introduction to mortality, dread, and death. Yet E.B. White's classic also imposed the concept of birth, of mother. And Ziggy soon found in many more books countless characters relating to their own mothers as well as their fathers. It seemed no being could exist without parents, and surely Ziggy existed, for if he did not, he would not have thought to ask the Nanny, "Are you my mother?" And while maternal nature was indigenous to the geography of her heart, the Nanny admitted she was not. As Ziggy's eyes shimmered in woe, she explained that his parents, like Charlotte, had died, leaving him, their only child, behind. She didn't know how these lies leaked into her words, but they sunk her chest in deepest blue. Charlotte's Web remained Ziggy's favorite book until, at 18 months, he pulled from a shelf Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Here he discovered a being, an alleged monster, with neither a mother nor father, save the mad scientist who made the poorest substitute. The tragedy proved too bleak for Ziggy's young mind, and so he imagined a different plot in which the pitiable monster thinks better of revenge, and through a series of improbable events finds his way to the farm on which Wilbur has been allowed to live. Ziggy could not explain why such characters, one sentenced to death, the other unfit for life, resounded so within him, but he wore away his crayons, depicting the pig and the monster romping together in a field of wild and wildly colorful flowers, red and orange and purple and pink, blooming against a cornflower sky, and sun left white and uncolored, all the air flecked by checkmark birds. The Nanny marveled at Ziggy's art. Wilbur did, albeit roughly, resemble the illustrations in Charlotte's Web, while Frankenstein's creation appeared as the child's own, an interpretation inspired as much by Shelley's words as the humanoid form exhibited by every adult he'd encountered in the estate and also in books, in portraits and photos, on the few hours of television permitted. To be sure, this is how Ziggy saw himself, as human. This pleased the genetic engineer, though he voiced concern over the child's uneven lines, barely containing the colors of their shapes. The boy now read texts reserved for 9th graders, but his art appeared like that of a child 6 years younger. Never mind that Ziggy had just turned 2. The geneticist presented a battery of exams to assess his subject's true cognitive ability. At first, Ziggy found the challenge exciting, but by page 8 the tests were no longer a game. He went to get up, only to be told he absolutely had to finish if he ever expected dinner. By the end, he was as hungry as fatigued, yet the geneticist was contented, and once the exams were graded, Ziggy's intelligence was declared to be unlike that of any child. No news to the Nanny. Ziggy went to bed early that night, but was back at his paper and crayons the next morning. He crafted what the Nanny recognized as herself, or at least a forgiving portrait. The boy was gracious enough not to include the crow's feet clawing from the corners of each eye. He requested that she draw him as well. But the Nanny told the child that not everyone could capably commit to paper the images of others, and that he possessed a very special talent. Still, despite the Nanny's efforts, Ziggy soon saw himself as he truly appeared. He'd been playing wildly and collapsed to rest at the lip of the pond he'd edged nearer each day for weeks. Weightless clouds sailed the pure blue above, while below birds and squirrels frolicked in rustling trees. Upon a hill a lone jackrabbit leapt and vanished in brush. The scene presented itself idyllic in every sense until Ziggy leaned over to observe a school of tadpoles darting under water. There in front of him, staring from the shallow depths, was a face he recognized from toys and books. "Nanny!" he exclaimed, "there's a piglet in the pond!" As those words left him, he saw the mouth of the animal move in time to his own. Ziggy turned his head one way, then the other, watching as the uncanny creature kept pace. He pried wide his mouth and stuck out his tongue, and so did the pig. For the first time in all his short life, he thought to make a snout of his own nose, only to feel exactly what he saw. This piglet in the pond had hands for hooves, and felt his own face with the same increasing alarm, and all the while squealed, "Is that me?" Ziggy recoiled, his mind trembling under the weight of a warping world, his tiny body shuddering in sobs as the nanny reached his side. When he finally cried his eyes red and dry, he dismissed himself and peered again into the water, and for the first time took a good look at his own visage. It wasn't that he had anything against pigs. In fact, some of his best imaginary friends were pigs. But what was he, with all his disparate parts? "Do you not have a tail?" he asked, and he did not need to see the nanny shake her head. Knowing no better, he thought nothing of his own. Yet he now cursed his brain for thinking himself anything other than a freak. Far removed from all the places he'd read about or seen on TV, he recognized his life as one lived in exile. Whether cast from society for his own good or the good of the world, he was a pariah for being both pig and monster. "Did you know my parents?" he asked. "Do you know, were they like me?" "There's no one in this world like you, Ziggy," said the nanny, "and that's why you're here." Her intention truer than her words, she placed a gentle hand upon the child's back and assured him that she loved him with all her heart. "But what about my mother? And what was she, anyway? A person? A pig?" "Technically, I suppose she was both, just as you are. However, at least from what I understand, she only looked the part of the pig. Not that it matters. She loved you all the same. Even if she was all pig, she was your mother." "How did she die?" The nanny could not tell Ziggy about the thankless job his mother never applied for, and about the countless siblings whose organs were divvied among an inexhaustible legion of sickly customers. Had his mother been parceled as well? For all she truly knew, the poor sow might still be churning out children she would never keep. Could such a grim prospect inspire hope? The nanny swore she could reveal nothing more, and insisted they ask the geneticist. And when that humorless man offered full disclosure, Ziggy could not resist. His soft face was spotted with electrodes trailing tangled wires to a metal box of knobs, dials, and switches. Every synaptic nuance of his response would illume a flat, matte screen. The scientist sought to determine whether the specimen was capable of emotion. Ziggy sat patient and perplexed as the geneticist rambled on about human organs failing in increasing numbers due mostly to user error. Nevertheless, he declared his species a clever one. He touted his own role in the creation of the living, breathing beings he'd patented and from the sale of which he profited. He alleged all the organs of these animals were not only his to sell, but free of the clogged arteries and other blockages afflicting those they replaced. He claimed every vessel of blood pumped from mother's heart to child's, and he trumpeted an empire of viscera so vast that Ziggy's parents were no more unique to him than drops of blood in a bucket of deep red. In fact, the indiscriminate particulars of artificial insemination among clones made it possible to pinpoint precisely which pig had fathered which bastard. Fortunately, however, his mother's lineage could be traced, and records indicated that ZG 31717400611, Ziggy's mother, was dead, her body cut open and apart and divided among ailing customers. Even the poor sow's brain rendered with the rest of the scraps and fed back into the unsuspecting ranks of separated, enslaved siblings. Forever snuffed was the joy, however ephemeral, sparked by the recurrent thought that she might one day keep her children and keep them safe. "You're the lucky one," said the chief genetic engineer. "You'd face the same fate if you were any less an anomaly." His mouth continued to open and close, his tiled teeth flashing in monitor light. The chaos of trauma crashed on screen in craggy spikes, but Ziggy no longer heard a word. He could only wonder what sort of world he'd been born into. Finally, the child asked, "But what about her heart?" His voice cracked, broke. He cleared his throat of the rubble and tried again. "What happened to her heart?" For the first time that Ziggy could recall, the mad scientist smirked. Certainly this notion was foolish, but in so much of the figurative lore the child had read, the heart was the home of love. And so it stood to reason his mother's love for him resided still in that very muscle beating now in another breast. "That information is doctor-client privilege," came the cold reply. "Besides, we can't have a little pig boy showing up on a client's doorstep." His own heart broken, Ziggy turned and tried to flee. The scientist watched without a flicker of emotion as his subject struggled against the snarl of electrodes. The days following saw Ziggy sink into a paralyzing abyss of depression. The nanny could scarcely motivate him to eat, much less play or talk. She carried him outside, his little limbs limp, eyes shut against the sun. She pointed out all the things he loved, birds and squirrels and caterpillars and rabbits, but he lacked the will to emerge from his sad little head. Despite himself and all he knew to be indelibly true, he sometimes envisioned his mother championed by her own Charlotte, yet even this fantasy was fleeting, for a humble spider would never sway his Frankenstein. These long days grew into longer weeks, but before the melancholic month was up, the nanny dressed the child and, keeping her back to the nearest security camera, stuffed his backpack with clothes and toy animals. Lacing his sneakers, she announced in a whisper that they were about to embark on their greatest adventure yet. She marched Ziggy the long way around the estate and buckled him into the passenger seat of her modest car. It was the first time he could recall being in an actual automobile, and this prompted him to finally speak again. "Where are we going?" "I told you." Ziggy blinked at her. "Our greatest adventure?" The nanny smiled slyly. The child watched as she pulled right up to the estate's gates, prompting the elderly security guard to stagger from his booth, both legs asleep. The nanny produced a rubber-banded roll of green paper, and the old man lit up. He gawked at the nanny and the child, and then, as though spellbound, opened the gate. Soon enough they sped along the open highway, the nanny singing behind the wheel, Ziggy basking in crisp wind, the world outside a kaleidoscope of oak and sequoia, lurching hills and mountains crowned in snow. These fugitives were an hour on the road before spotting a single other vehicle, and only then an enormous truck. As they passed the cab, the haggard driver glanced from beneath the threadbare brim of his cap, and then again, his eyes bulging the second take. He would later tell what he saw, and the barkeep would refuse another drink. Yet this bleary-eyed trucker was not alone. The child and his nanny passed, and were passed by many other vehicles of all shapes, their drivers and passengers all sizes. More than a few glimpsed this little boy pig. Yet only once did Ziggy find himself eye to eye with another child. This little girl, strapped in the back of an overstuffed station wagon, appeared completely human. Still, she shared with Ziggy an unspoken connection forged of innate kindness and curiosity. And as her weary and oblivious mother exited the interstate, she waved goodbye. Ziggy held up his own hand, his fingers. This strange little girl smiled, and so did he. By now, the air streamed power lines and chemtrails under a stagnant mantle of smog and stench. Arid plains stood host to oscillating pump jacks, and countless cattle swarmed in flies and filth and shimmering misery. 4 days of such desolate civilization, of tourist traps baited with fast food and petrol and plastic, of yesteryear's roadside motels and time-worn strip malls, of runaways and refugees, and of roadkill. And the nanny finally steered clear of the highway. Following directions dictated by the innocuous voice of the navigation system, the nanny maneuvered through a maze of suburban streets, passing row after row of cloned abodes, every lawn irrigated the same vivid green. Finally, she stopped in front of a house that, with its picket fence and eggshell walls and security badges emblazoned on every tempered window, appeared no more or less significant than all the others. She cut the engine and said, "We're here." Ziggy's gaze flitted from the nanny to the house and back. Her smile bittersweet, the nanny said, "The woman who lives here, she has your mother's heart." Ziggy attempted neither to move nor to speak. He didn't know how to respond or whether response was possible. He'd thought this was what he wanted, next to his mother being alive and well, and now he was afraid of what he might discover. "If you don't want to go in, you don't have to," said the nanny. She didn't utter a word of how, having not only bribed the guard at the gate, but also the laboratory assistant who gave her this address, she'd spent nearly every penny to bring him here. A long moment passed, and Ziggy finally said, "Would you come with me?" This was precisely what the nanny had intended, of course, and so she took his hand and led him along the arced path of broken seashells smothered in cement to the pressed wood door. Ziggy hid behind her as she rang the bell not once but 3 times. Eventually, a cacophony of clomps heralded the arrival of a woman who, through a rank plume of cigarette smoke and thin lips painted a putrid shade of pink, hissed, "Yes?" This dyspeptic stranger with her bleached blonde bouffant and taut muumuu was the size of a sow, fattened for slaughter, and deep within the tumid flab sagging against her straining frame struggled the heart of Ziggy's mother. "I have someone here who would very much like to meet you," said the nanny. The fleshy woman glanced past either side of the nanny's head and saw no one, and yet she gasped in sudden joy, "Oh, hallelujah, sister! Come on in! Your work here is already done. Many years ago I accepted the good Lord Jesus Christ into my heart." She what? Ziggy wondered who this Jesus was, and if he had anything to do with the woman's heart failing in the first place. "Are you thirsty? Would you like a diet soda?" "Thanks," but it was too late. The nanny was being ushered inside the suburban lair. Ziggy scrambled to keep up and keep hidden. His eyes fluttered ahead, scanning shelves crowded with glass and porcelain figurines, many of which were molded into the shapes of pigs and other farmed animals, laughing and dancing and playing miniature instruments. Perhaps his mother's heart had found a good home. "How about a ham sandwich?" "No," the nanny interjected. "Thank you, but please, listen. Not long ago, you accepted a heart transplant." "Jesus, is it being recalled?" Uh, no. But I'm not sure donor is the right word, but the former owner, well, she has a son." "What? That heart came from a pig?" The nanny assured the woman that even pigs have children, and before Ziggy knew it, she'd stepped aside to unveil him in all his hybrid splendor. And there was a shriek so shrill that many a prized figurine shattered in place. Ziggy tried to subdue the volatile matron with appeal and reason. If there was but a modicum of love left in his mother's heart, he hoped to stir it to the surface of a smile. Yet this woman kept screaming and screeching like a berserk and emotionally unassailable behemoth. And the child saw how she recognized in him nothing to love, and he recognized nothing in her. He now knew for certain that his mother's heart was no longer her own. Her love had been extinguished with her life. Ziggy peered up at his nanny and saw fresh tears glide slick down each cheek. Regardless of all else, here stood a woman who had been there his entire life. She loved him as much as any mother ever could, and would always and forever. Perhaps only then did Ziggy realize she meant as much to him. And so he reached up and smiled, and she took his hand, and together they left. That night they splurged on the most well-appointed motel of their travels, and as they prepared for bed they saw on the rabbit-eared television a news report on multiple sightings of a wee boy pig traveling in the company of an unidentified woman. The reporter stood in front of the eggshell haunt, with the overwrought ogre still quaking as though she might erupt molten venom. And then a jump cut to another familiar face, that of the chief genetic engineer, as he swatted a swarm of microphones and denied in his most insincere monotone all allegations as pure rubbish. Ziggy asked the nanny what would happen if he told his tale to the reporter, and she cautioned such a gesture would expose his very existence to the wider world. People can be cruel. He knew this by now, of course, and said, "But I can't help what I was born." "No one can, child." "But, Nanny, you're not like me, and I'm not like you, and if we can see past our differences, can't everyone?" It sounded simple, but he was giving people a great deal of credit. Then again, perhaps the nanny wasn't giving them enough. "My mother is gone," he said, "and probably my father too, whoever he was. And I know I can never bring them back.
But there are so many others. I think I might even have sisters and brothers. In fact, I'm sure of it. And if I don't do something, and do it soon, they'll end up like. He could not bear the thought, yet knew his weakness would never transform the world in its cocoon of myopic ego. And as long as men like the geneticist claimed the lives of others, such metamorphosis would be vital. As proud as she'd ever been of anyone, the nanny vowed aid in Ziggy's intrepid quest. But first, she insisted they lie down and rest. She switched off the lamp and curled next to him and in the dark stroked warm tears from his face. She hummed to him a lullaby she'd forgotten until that moment, and only then recognized the melody her own mother sang to her so many years before. Nestled against her breast, the child found solace in the lost lullaby and the persistent beat of this dear woman's heart. Perhaps for the first time he truly slept like a baby. The fairy tale was over, but his life was just beginning. I wanted to make a quick note about some of the things that may be new to you that were mentioned or featured in Shad's story. First of all, the name of the first setting is Animal Pharm. They call it Animal Pharm, and obviously you'll see this when you read the story, but listening to the story, you don't know that it's farm, Pharm. You know, as with all science fiction, there's truth all over it, and such is the case here too. Researchers have been using animals for years to grow genetically engineered organs in their bodies and then have those organs transplanted to humans. And pigs, whose organs are the same shape and size as that of humans, are already being bred for this. This is called cross-species transplantation or xenotransplantation, XENO, xenotransplantation. And of course, the pigs who are used and killed for this process aren't the only ones who suffer. In laboratories, they use baboons to act as human models to try to perfect the process. Their biggest challenge is stopping the human body from rejecting the organs from other animals. Yeah, that's a problem. And so they use baboons to test the transplants of hearts and kidneys. And then, of course, they're cloning animals to this end as well. The baboons are killed when they're done, and all the while, most of the heart disease and even kidney disease that we face in the Western world is caused by lifestyle habits, namely eating animals and their secretions. So, I just want to go through this and make sure I understand this. We genetically alter animals to breed them to grow quickly so that we can kill them to eat them. And then we develop diseases related to this consumption. We destroy our bodies and our organs because our bodies cannot process all of this animal protein and all of this fat and cholesterol. And then through animal experimentation, we come up with drugs and surgeries and science fiction like research and procedures, putting animals through immense suffering and pain in order to patch the problem that could have been prevented in the first place. Okay, got it. So the other word that might be unfamiliar to you, and it's related to all of this, to genetic research, and you heard me use the word chimera, which is Chimera. In biological research, chimeras are artificially produced by physically mixing cells from two different organisms. So, for example, you have something called a geep, which is in 1984, researchers produced a geep, which is an animal that was the result of combining embryos from a goat and a sheep. So that's that in a nutshell. And we'll talk more about cloning and xenotransplantation and animal research. We haven't really gotten there yet. I'm just touching on it a little bit in episodes as they come up. So I hope you enjoyed the story. I find it very moving. I find Ziggy to be incredibly sympathetic and the nanny, and there's a lot I could say about it, but I don't like saying too much. I'd like you kind of coming to your own conclusions about it. So you can certainly go to compassionatecookscommunity.com and discuss this story. And again, I encourage you to check out shadclark.com. Thank you, Shad, for writing the story and for letting me share it with everyone. And thank you, everyone, for listening. For the animals, this is Colleen from Compassionate Cooks. Be well.